Hi guys. Good evening,
Hello.
good morning, wherever you guys are. So for people who are watching the stream, if you can hear us, just let us know in the comments and say hello to us if you are there. Yeah, guys in the live stream, if you can hear us, can you just put in the comments that it's good to go, and then we'll get started. Okay, amazing. Thank you, Sienna. Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Eskwelabs. We are a tech startup that inspires, equips, and connects people to the future of work. And we're very excited that you are joining us today for this special conversation. So for those who think they're joining for a class, I'm sorry to disappoint you. We will teach you something today, but it will not be related to data. So yeah, please don't go after I've said this. Although I'm afraid that it might be a disappointment for some people who are here. So today we are actually having a special conversation as a part of the Skoll World Forum Live. So let me tell you a bit about what that is, and then I will introduce our topic and our panelist. So the Skoll Forum is an annual gathering in the UK of thinkers and doers who are showcasing entrepreneurial solutions on a global stage. And we're very excited to be a part of the conversation this year. Of course, the event has moved online, which is why we are appearing to you by stream from the Philippines and from Spain. So if you can let us know where you're tuning in from, which country you're watching this from, and what time of the day it is for you right now in the comments, that would be really cool to see if we also have folks from the UK, from Europe, or North America who's tuned in to the session. All right. So I know we're all affected by COVID, right? So and there's a, it's a range of how people are affected, but of course, if you are a student, a parent, or an educator, your life probably has been turned upside down recently. And of course, here at Eskwelabs, we really felt it as well. As an edtech startup that does blended learning, Aurelian can tell you a bit later about the crazy changes that's been happening around here since a couple of weeks ago. So because of that experience, as well as we know this is something many people are going through, we were inspired to put together this conversation. And obviously, there's a lot of very short-term things that are happening. Classes are being moved online. Parents are scrambling to entertain their kids and help them learn. And from our perspective, there's some impacts around adult learning and how that's changing people's perception as how they approach training as the economy takes a downturn. So let me now turn to our panelists. So this is a quite informal conversation, but I'll still ask them to introduce themselves. So we're very excited to be joined by Alberto and Aurelian, and I'll give them a couple minutes to introduce themselves, and maybe we can start with Alberto.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Angela. So my name is Alberto. I am calling in from Spain today, which is where I'm from, although I'm usually based in San Francisco. I am the co-founder of Transcend Network, which is a fellowship for early stage founders in the future of learning, future of work. We were lucky to have Eskwelabs as one of our fellow companies in their previous cohort that we ran, graduated about a month ago. And this second cohort, we had 19 founders from 12 different countries. So it's very much a global movement. And we work with these early stage founders that are working on different spaces in this kind of education and future of work space. So I've been thinking a lot about how COVID-19 has affected different industries and different sectors. And I think most of my questions around this and most of the time that I've spent researching around the impact of COVID has been both on the economics and how it might affect early stage startups like Eskwelabs and others. But also just kind of on the student side, how have student perceptions changed? How might this be paving the way for future models that I think are really interesting questions, and I'm excited to dive a little bit deeper into those today.
Awesome, amazing. That sounds like we're in store for a lot of insights by picking your brain. Aurelian?
Yeah. Hi, guys. I'm Aurelian. I'm Angela's co-founder. So I've been with Eskwelabs for about a year. It's been 1 year since we started. Prior to this, and Eskwelabs is kind of a blended learning educational startup. But now we're, like everyone else, having to adapt and try out different things, including in the purely virtual space. And we did focus initially on data science and now have broadened that to a broader set of 21st century skills, including now looking specifically at the support that we can provide for virtual workers, remote workers based in the Philippines. Prior to this, I was a management consultant with the firm Dahlberg, which focuses on international development topics and specifically focusing on how do we support multilateral institutions and governments to provide the educational systems that can support a 21st century workforce. So I think a lot of the trends that we've been kind of looking at over the last decade, some of them have probably been greatly accelerated by COVID, while others of them are quite interesting in that they kind of go in the opposite direction. So I think that that's going to be something pretty exciting to talk about.
Cool, awesome. So it's good to know that you guys all have different hats to put on in this conversation, both from like a starter perspective, from a more macro perspective, and also like a system point of view. So, okay, so for guys who are in the live stream, so now you've heard about the background of our panelists. If you have specific questions that you're interested in or themes you want us to explore, please put them in the comments. So I'll look at my phone once in a while and check out if anything's posted there and try to incorporate things that you're interested in into the conversation. But the format of this is we'll just get started. I mean, this is, again, very formal. We'll just kind of chat back and forth, and we will, I'll attempt to have some time at the end specifically for audience Q&A. If not, we can just continue the conversation for, the next 15 minutes or so. Okay, sounds good, guys?
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
And just to reiterate it on that, I would love to answer any specific questions that the audience has and just try to incorporate that into our conversation as much as possible to make it relevant to everyone.
Yeah, for sure. So I will be checking my phone actively. Hopefully it's updating. So yeah, let us know what you want to hear. So maybe I can kick off by asking you guys a question that I really want to know. So, Eskwelabs is blended learning. We really believed in that because we saw that pure online learning did not work with very low completion rates. So what I'm seeing now in the media is online learning is somehow brought back from the dead, almost, as being called, revolutionary. It's allowing all these kids, and adults who are in university to continue learning while at home. And some people are even saying that this could be one of the silver linings to come out of the pandemic. That now, this traditional way of teaching and lecture is being challenged. Do you guys think that's true, or is that too positive or too optimistic to think that after this moment passes, somehow, education has been fundamentally changed by the crisis, or this is just news or fake news?
Yeah. I can kick off the conversation, and
Sure.
Lilian, please, or Angela, both of you, just feel free to come in at any time.
Yeah.
Probably. I think I fundamentally believe this is kind of one of those like black swan events that will actually shape the way that we think about education for the future. That being said, I think these kind of events are never easy, or like we're never prepared for these moments, and I don't think we were prepared for this either. I think it's going to be a revolution when we look back and it's in the history books, and we can look back at it and say, oh, this was the time when everyone tried online learning. But in terms of the teacher preparedness, student preparedness, even just like basic infrastructure, we were not ready for this. And I think a lot of students are having very negative experiences in their first time that they're trying online learning. So there's a really comprehensive survey with 35,000 students, both high school and college in the US, that try to understand this perception of online learning after spending 2 weeks roughly doing online learning. And only 10% of students actually felt like their experience was superior to what they had experienced before. And 45% of them said that their experience was much worse. So it's, yeah, and there, obviously there's a lot of in between, right? Like maybe the online learning experience doesn't need to be much better. It just needs to be good enough. And I'll share the links later during the call. But I think in general we're not ready for this, and there's a lot of growing pains around that. But I think this experience of online learning is going to put us in a mindset to actually train our teachers to be prepared for this type of online learning experiences. It's going to actually fundamentally change a lot of the structures around education. And I think it will actually have a great impact. It's just that these kind of revolutions in history are never smooth, and they're I think a lot of us, like, we're all experiencing some of the pains that are coming with it. So
yeah, it's really interesting you say like the structure of education is changing, because when I think about our perspective, when we try to do online lessons, we're actually not planning them the same way as we are doing the in-person lessons. And when I think about like the holy trinity of education, of what's happening in a classroom, it's like there's a lecture, there's a discussion, and then there's some sort of assignment, right? So anyways, now the lecture is being put online, but the discussion and assignment, it's like something is happening, but that experience is nowhere near the same as having it in person.
yeah,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'll just argue that I think that's what needs to happen, right? Like, in the same way that when we took notes on a piece of paper, it was a fundamentally different act as taking notes on a laptop, because you have this computing power to make really interesting things at a different medium. You should be taking notes differently, right? And I think that's the same way it applies to learning. I think we should be learning differently when doing it online. And I think we're starting to figure out what things work and what things don't work. And I think that insight that you guys reached much earlier, probably a year ago, because you started experimenting with it, I think a lot of instructors and students have never come to that experimentation. And that's why I see it as such a fundamental shift in the way that we think about online learning. So completely agree.
Cool. Okay, so I will come back to you with this of how we can learn differently online. But yeah, Aurelian, can you jump in about this original question of like, do we think after this moment passes, somehow online learning will become the norm, or it's just going to, be forgotten again?
Yeah,
I mean, not
I think
forgotten again, but
I can play a bit of the contrarian to Alberto's perspective. I think that until now, I think online learning has kind of struggled to break out of a niche of I guess everything that kind of falls outside the core education cycle. So K through 12 and university is still dominated by relatively traditional learning experiences, some of which are progressively incorporating more and more kind of blended instances. But the shift to like purely online, I think, is fairly limited. I think that where online learning has done much better in terms of tutoring, supplementary education, kind of replacing the kind of maybe like you buying a textbook that you would read on your own. I think that they've done very well at. I really question whether the COVID moment is actually going to change that fundamental equilibrium. I think if we think of right now, COVID is a shock that kind of makes the demand for online learning surge because we can't do traditional education. But if, as Alberto's saying, like the way that online education works was not previously like sufficient to make people move away from traditional, mostly in person. I don't think that changes just because it's COVID, right? Now we don't have an alternative. But when this moment is over, I think for a lot of teachers, this may have been like, okay, that was not a great solution. I think it might accelerate us moving towards more blended solutions. But I think it's not like a shining moment for like online universities to come and disrupt traditional universities. I don't think people are going to like flock to like online K-12 schools. I think the experimentation on that side, I think still needs to go much further in terms of delivering the kind of user experience that people would want.
This is exactly why, Aurélien, you're here, because I know you will have a different opinion. And this will be a very lively discussion when people disagree. So I want to bring these questions that are being asked in the comments in. So I know, Alberto, you touched upon this idea of, now this current moment has shown us that teachers are actually not sufficiently trained to deliver things online, because online learning needs to be structured differently. So we do have educators who are on the call. And one of them asked, as we shift more to online learning, how can teachers be trained to deliver something that's just as good or even better than in person? And then another structure that we didn't mention in terms of in the process of learning is exams, is outside of the lecture, discussion, assignment. How can the capacity of schools be expanded around exams, given now that IB exams are canceled worldwide, as well as A levels and SATs?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was just talking to a few friends in Spain who were telling me about the way that they're going to be doing their assessments, their exams for university. And the way they're doing it is they have to be in a Zoom call. They have to complete an exam that's printed out and sent to them the day before. And they have to record themselves on Zoom doing the exam. And every 5 minutes, they'll randomly ask students to move to show that they're actually taking the exam and monitoring that they're not looking at their phone or something, which is really not ideal. I think everyone would agree on that. And then, so I guess to take a step back, when I think about that kind of capacity building effort, I think it's really not on the teachers right now. Like it's been, they've been completely overwhelmed, and it's not their fault. I think it's something that will likely fall more on governments and different upskilling initiatives that can be taken globally to train people, train these teachers. So another survey that was sent out, I think it was at the beginning of the month, they tried to understand how many teachers felt prepared to teach online, and it was roughly 60% of them that said they were not ready at all. The question was, are you prepared to facilitate remote learning? 60% said no. And of those teachers, 40% were the only ones who were in charge of structuring the tools that they would use for the classroom. So they're the ones who have to go sign up on Zoom, put together all the different, like learn how to share the documents on Google Docs and all these things, which that I think that is the key data point to me that shows that schools should be taking more initiative. It's just that schools don't really have, they've never had to learn it. And I like that Aurélien started to kind of break down different stages of education. I think for K-12, I just don't really think that online learning is the best way to teach at K-12, because you need to be, a lot of it is just kind of building basic social skills and emotional skills, right? So I don't think K-12 is going to go online anytime soon. I do think that the way we, like almost globally, do homework, for example, is something that will benefit from an online component. So I think in terms of the way that I see this affecting it, obviously will be different for every age bracket. And I think for schools, we just have a critical bottleneck there, which is the teachers don't really know how to do this remote learning experiences. it'll have to be a lot of government and public school system training programs to teach these professors. And my hope is that once they're able to see what works and what doesn't work, they'll be able to implement some aspect of online learning into their experience, where almost I think the blended learning idea will become obsolete. We'll just, like, everyone will assume that there's an aspect of remote and physical learning, in the same way that almost remote work has become. Every job is a remote job, basically, because you're just sitting on your email, you're sitting on Slack, whatever it is, and most knowledge sector jobs are remote jobs in a way. It just, no one calls them that because it doesn't even matter. So I think with education, we'll see a similar shift, and it will change on the degree of that involvement based on how relevant it is. So for adult learning, it could be like 80% of the instruction is done online, and only 20% is done in person.
What do you think about that, Aurelian?
Yeah, I think broadly, I think I would agree with like the direction of that. I guess to add like a couple of extra nuances, I think on the, I guess to start with the testing question, like you did, Alberto, I'd say, I think the technology to facilitate like very widespread remote testing, how do you monitor and detect for cheating? How do you make sure that it's, how do you incorporate adaptive learning so that the test isn't onerous? All of these, I think, have been around. They are there. There's a lot of methods. I don't think the technology is necessarily the barrier. And I think, but I think the main challenge is that I think these exams, right? You talk about like the Gaokao in China. You talk about the college entrance exams. These things, they're almost like voting exercises, and that like the key thing that matters is the integrity of the exam, and how do you replicate that process of integrity so that it's not facilitated by an AI or by remote monitoring. I think we end up with the same issue as with elections, and that's why I don't really see a lot of governments migrating to remote testing, even if they can do it. It'd probably be cheaper to implement. But I think in fields where this doesn't matter, like say like corporates, companies might want to do remote assessments for their own HR learning processes. I think they will, I mean, we're already seeing that they're much more willing to accept this. I think they will be the ones who kind of end up adopting a lot of this. But I think for the very big mass exams, I think those ones are still, as long as people don't trust the system, you wouldn't be able to just shift to that.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question on that for both of you guys. I guess an aspect of that exam question is that it's the whole system, right? Like the way we're choosing the subjects, the way we're developing that curriculum makes it so that an exam where you have to memorize a lot of stuff and then regurgitate it on a piece of paper, that makes sense. But I'm curious, in your blended model, the exams probably don't matter as much, right? I would assume. So I guess my question is, to what extent does the exam, to what extent is the exam a part of the wider pedagogical model that you build? Because maybe at some point, if what we're saying is that the exam is going to be bad anyways, then maybe technology just, there's no role for technology to play. It's just that you either shift to a better pedagogical model or not.
Yeah. I mean, I think we really have to look at like what is the purpose of this exam. If we're looking at, say, monitoring a learner's progress over time, then if anything, the advances in AI can help us get to more personalized testing, where we are really customizing the exam to each learner. And we can use that so that they're always getting exactly the right level of questions to test and probe on where they're at. You can even start using the exams themselves as teaching tools, right? You can push the answer. I mean, the questions that you answer force the things you have to learn, right? I think every teacher kind of knows that. That's how you end up with like badly built tests, end up with teachers who have to kind of teach to that. But I think the way most people think of exams is not as just the like monitoring your learner progress. I think for most, they're the credentialing instruments which decide whether you go to IIT, Bangalore or not. They decide, your progress, the funding that your school gets. And I think on that level, I think that's a design issue that goes far beyond what technology can do.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, so I'm collating the questions from the comments, and thank you guys for the ones who've already sent in the questions. They're really good. They're actually exactly the ones I prepared beforehand. So looks like everybody's kind of wondering about the same questions. So there's two other big themes I think people are wondering about. One is like the school to work transition, and then the other one is around inclusivity and things around like the digital divide that's now been exposed by now people shifting to online learning. But before going there, let me just ask you guys this one last question around, this is from somebody who is a student and is suffering through this process of now having to do stuff online. So they want to know about if you guys have pieces of advice for educators on strategies and mindsets they could adopt to make online learning better and more bearable for the students, what those things could be. And also, as you're just kind of talking, Alberto, I was wondering if you can, also bring in and speak a bit about your experience going through Minerva schools and what that experience has taught you about, what works when it comes to online learning.
Yeah. So I think when I answered this question, and I've been getting this question a lot, which I think is good. I like when people reach out with this idea, but my experience comes from being at the school called Minerva Schools, which is a school I graduated from last year. I was a part of the inaugural class, and basically you move with students to different parts of the world. You do your degree of 7 different cities, but the instruction happens fully online. So you're moving with the students, but then taking the class in your room, in the library, wherever you do it, right? And it's a fully active learning pedagogical model, which makes it a little bit different than most schools because we didn't have exams. We had to show our progress through assessments and through assignments and through our participation in class. And so we didn't have a lot of these kind of bottlenecks that teachers are experiencing. So because I'm a proponent of this active learning model, I will say that in terms of the things that have worked, that I've seen work in other classrooms, sometimes it's physical classrooms, but I think this is particularly relevant for online experiences, is that the lecture model just really does not work online because you have so many distractions, right? And like it's kind of ironic because we're doing this in a way. We're talking to an audience and we're expecting them to listen. But I think in many ways, my recommendation would be take as much as you can from the information sharing side of things, put that online, put that in a video that students can double speed if they want. They can they can listen to while they're doing laundry or whatever it is. And then make the online, like the online interaction part about engaging with one another with that content that you've learned, discussing what you've learned, giving feedback on each other, doing activities, because I think that is an activity that's much better suited for online, where you can just come in with information that you have and then engage in much more exciting experiences with your peers. And to the point of lecture models do not work offline, fair, but also I think when you're offline, you have a higher incentive to engage because you're seeing the person's gestures, right? Like the teacher is just like engaging you more because they're moving around the room. They're like, maybe you feel some sort of pressure to pay attention because you're sitting in a chair in a lecture hall. But or in a classroom, whereas I could be in my pajamas for all you guys know, right? And I could just be sipping, I don't know, just like sipping wine while I'm listening to a lecture. So my recommendation would be try to like offload all the content sharing part earlier on, before you actually get into the class, and then the class you can make it as engaging and as interactive as possible.
Can you share with us an example of that? Like what is, if when you think back to your Minerva experience, was there one activity that you did in one of these online interactions that's very memorable you can share with us? Just do an example what that means.
Yeah, so I was talking to a few people in Spain about how they could try to implement these activities. And I was trying to think about how I would apply this to my high school curriculum. So I went to high school in Spain, and it was a fairly traditional education model. And I was thinking of geography as a subject that I think is particularly well fit for this type of activities, where we had to memorize a whole map of the world with every single capital, every single country, and I liked it a lot, so I really enjoyed it. But I can guarantee 99% of the class hated this experience. They had to do it at home, just kind of like learn the thing, and then go into the class, and then just like take an exam, and then everybody copied in the exam because no one liked it. This is the kind of stuff where if you have some sort of competition the next day, and you're divided into groups, and then you have to I don't know, you have to compete to see how many points you can get, and that's a competition that's spread throughout the semester. Then the students can go home and study the maps in the same way they would study it for if the teacher was pointing at things in a blackboard, but they have some sort of incentive to come to class the next day because they know it's going to be an interactive. It's just a game, right? It's like, let's see who can get the most I don't know, capitals of the world. Or it can be something where there's a I don't know, a random shape of a country is shown on the screen, and then whoever raises their hand on Zoom first gets to answer it. So it's like literally like a TV like a TV show, and something like that, where you can do a more interactive stuff. That's just like something that came to mind, but I think it's applicable to most subjects.
Cool. So if I were to summarize that in one word, the mindset, to answer this question, what kind of mindset teachers or professors should have the mindset of a game show host, right?
Yeah. I guess, and I would trust Aurelian's opinion on this more than myself, because he does this every day. But I think setting somewhere between a facilitator and a coach that is able to, who understands the students, and when a student maybe is not willing to participate, they can see why it is that they're not doing it, and then maybe have a 10-minute chat after the class and say, hey, like, Aurelian, you didn't know a single country, like, what's going on? Like, and so being both a host, a show host, but also I guess that coach or the mentor that is also kind of willing to, who has your back, I guess.
Cool. Aurelian's probably smiling because he's thinking, I would know every single country, because that's the person that you are. Can you share more with us, Aurelian, like based on your experience of us doing blended learning and also now doing stuff online? Yeah, what would be the mindset to set an educator up for success?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can talk about what not success first, because I think we also learned that personally. I think as an educator, oftentimes your first thought is kind of, these are the actions that I do in my normal class, in my normal teaching. So now I just need to do them online. Okay, like this is my lesson plan. I'm just going to do it online. And that really, doesn't work for a lot of the reasons that Alberto raised, right? It's like the engagement levels are like a much lower baseline. The student community just isn't present in the same way. So I think what we've had to do is kind of instead of looking at the activities that you do of a successful in-person class, which a lot of educators know a lot about, look at the elements of what makes that class work, right? The students, like engagement with each other, the clarity of how the lessons flow. And then you kind of reverse engineer the entire course to aim for those elements, now knowing that you are online. So now that you're online, how do you facilitate classroom engagement? Because offline, you don't even need that many exercises. You don't even need that many group projects because students are in a classroom, they're sitting next to someone, they're gonna have to like interact anyways. But online, they can just be on Facebook the other half of the time. And I think what's tricky there is that when you look at that, it's not a problem that hasn't been like looked at by others, right? There's a lot of people who are looking at how exactly do you do online engagement, but they're not in the education sector. And so we tend to not look at them. But I think that's exactly, I think when we talk about like, why do so many like ed apps look like games? I mean, that's one model. I don't think it's the only model. I think sometimes it's actually like a pretty pernicious path to go down. But that's just an example that we can look for inspiration outside of what we traditionally do.
And just to comment on that last part, Aurelian, I think that's, in my mind, what's going to explain the shifts that we're going to see from this event is that everyone's going to develop their own playbook for what works online, what doesn't, based on their experiences, rather than that knowledge being trapped in an academic conference that is like, I don't know, held in somewhere in the world. I think everyone's going to have some sort of experience with online learning, and hopefully they want to continue engaging with it because, as you said, like we've been doing this for a long time. Like there's and the data is not looking great. Like actually, online learning in a few studies with U.S. universities, it's shown that it actually exacerbates the gap between high achieving students and lower achievers, between high income and low income. Like we really need to rethink these models, and for that to happen, we need to engage everyone. And so I think that's I just thought that was a really important point, and it's also necessary to make online learning work because right now it's not really working, to be honest.
Interesting. So if I were to summarize what Aurelian said on top of the game show host and the mentor as a mindset for the instructor would be almost like a UX designer, looking at the interaction design of what the user journey is for the student. And definitely from a startup perspective, it's very interesting to think like that. So Alberto, I know you mentioned just now the studies in the US where online learning is widening the gap between students coming from different social economic backgrounds. So maybe we can shift our conversation a bit towards the idea of inclusivity. I mean, I'd be curious to learn a bit more about that study, about why, what is the reason for that, as well as I think maybe Aurelian, you can come in a bit on the emerging market context of actually just having internet access or not is really making or breaking somebody's just direct access to something like online learning.
Yeah, and this is probably the biggest question, I think, when we think about learning in the post-COVID world. I think the biggest question should be what inequalities is this shift exacerbating that were pre-existing. So the UNESCO does I think it's like a weekly or daily update of how many students have been forced out of the classroom due to COVID, and right now we're at 1.5 billion students, which is 90% of the student population in the world, which is crazy to think about. And when you look at high-income countries versus middle and low-income countries, 90% of students in high-income economies are able to do remote learning in some way or other. I know in Spain, as a high-income economy, there are a lot of challenges. There's a lot of kids that don't have a laptop at home, right? And they need to do their classes on their phones, and maybe they have 6 kids at home using one phone for all of the classes, and maybe their parents need it for work. So there's a lot of challenges on that. But then when we shift to the middle and low income economies, it's only 26% of students that are able to do remote learning in some sort of way. So the biggest thing is that 74% of students are not in school, which is a huge failure in terms of outcomes. It's going to really take a hit. They might have to do extra months. They might even have to do an extra half a year before they graduate, right? So I think that this is a relevant, very relevant question. And I mean, I don't have the answers, but I think it's just something to take into account. There's going to have to be a massive set of programs to reach that 74% of students that are not even online. This, just to reference, this university study that I mentioned before was a George Mason university paper written in 2009. And this more recent data point, I recommend checking out the CGD, the Center for Global Development. They've done really, really good work around analyzing this data from UNESCO. But I would love to know from your perspective, being in the Philippines. I'm curious. Yeah. What you guys are seeing on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think I started seeing like all the messages about, like people going online, and I guess like Ministry of Education of China like started launching like online classes like crazy, people transitioning to that, then kind of all around the world, like people transitioning. I think in the Philippines, most of the major universities, including in the University of the Philippines, which is the large public university set, they announced a transition to online learning during COVID, and then they had to cancel it because a lot of students cannot follow university from their home. I think exactly to Alberto's point. And I think, and now I think it's pretty much like that's probably the reality across most of the planet, is that when you transition to online learning, it's kind of like the transition to work from home. It's the people or the communities that were already in the best situation that can do that. For most, it's not a possibility. I think where there may be a silver lining to this is that I think for a long time, the investment into the IT infrastructure has been seen as like, yes, it is nice to have, but I mean, we have so many pressing issues in this country and other countries. Like, you're fighting for budget from health, you're fighting for budget from K to 12. The internet is not a constitutional right unless you're in South Africa. And I think now, people are going to think, actually, maybe the internet is closer to a constitutional right in the 21st century, because when this happened, we couldn't do anything. People who can't work from home, people can't learn from home. Now they're going to lose half a year, lose 1 year, who knows? So I think that hopefully will maybe change the way the conversation happens around the digital divide. I think the digital divide has been kind of it's probably not a top of mind issue in any country. Like, it's not in your top 5, it's not in your top 10. There are many other significant things. I think this might be something that's a bit of a wake up call, that it's not just for, like a couple of like education researchers to like argue over, but it's actually very real.
So it's really interesting that, like, Alberto, you were talking about in developing countries, the differences between somebody having a laptop and a phone. Like, to me, that's more of that's a better problem to have than, let's say, in the Philippines, where you don't have a laptop, or maybe potentially, and no internet. Given that right now, I mean, education is an expenditure for governments, right? Do you guys think that there is, like, online learning needs decentralized infrastructure, essentially, instead of schools that are in one place where everybody goes? Everybody needs to have some sort of infrastructure that they have in their homes to be able to do that. What do you guys think of, like, how do we finance that? what's the government's role in that, or how can we build that decentralized infrastructure to make all the stuff that we're talking about around how to make online learning better. How can we even allow it to happen?
I'm not super familiar with the infrastructure question, so I think Aurélien might have more thoughts on that myself.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we don't. Let's not take it into an infrastructure direction. I think the main thing is that from, I think, a lot of perspectives, like the growth of the internet has been seen as like, oh, like there's private sector incentives, it will naturally build itself out. The Philippines doesn't have net neutrality. I'm pretty sure half of the bandwidth of this building is going to like Netflix or Facebook. Facebook tried to pass, its own kind of free internet access in India. I think in a lot of emerging markets, this is kind of the perspective. And I think there's still this kind of lingering thought that like in education, like this is not really our domain. We'll launch like a couple of MOOCs, but it hasn't been mainstreamed to the point that you would expect for something that might be that is the main university system in your country. K-12, I think, is even further behind, but I think it has to start somewhere. And I think where we hope is that if this becomes like integrated into like the core thing of moving forward, now the University of the Philippines is thinking much more about this, they're also going to become one of the most vocal advocates for how can we also expand access to student polls.
Yeah, so I guess the reason behind why I asked the infrastructure question is a lot of the conversation around online learning is like, how can we make the approach is better? How can we make this better? When a part of it is now, I think one good thing that I see that could happen is now more people are going to come to the space, and then we'll see actually there are other questions to be answered too. Like the idea of online learning is that it's much cheaper, but actually that cost structure is just been it's decentralized, right? Like that cost is being bared by the individual families. And so now we will have maybe more people come into the space with a non-education background who will now, use their public policy brains or their finance brains to think about, okay, like there's another piece of this puzzle that needs to be there. So then these educators can do their jobs better. So for guys in the live stream, the team is now trying to send the links from Alberto from all the studies that he mentioned. So you'll get those shortly. Okay, cool. So let's now, I actually noticed there's only 10 minutes left and there aren't a lot of other questions that we haven't addressed. So let's quickly talk about the work implication, the school to work implication. So there was a question earlier around the fact that post-secondary students are originally going to spend their summers doing co-op, internships, things that will really enrich their learning experience. And given that now a lot of those opportunities are going to, fall through, obviously there will be some short-term tactical things that need to be done to like remedy that. But do we think that there will be any changes in how the school to work transition is integrated going forward after COVID, and how educators are going about thinking about this issue?
Yeah, I can take a first stab at it. Yeah, the hiring question is not looking very good right now. I've been doing a bit of a deep dive into it in the last few days, and there's the same report that I mentioned by a firm called Niche, which I linked to. It's the first link that was just shared with everyone. 92% of college seniors in the US were worried about their ability to pay for education as a result of coronavirus. So there is going to be a very big change in the way that we think about education, because the business model is going to have to change. This is the first time, like in most recessions, university ends up being a counter-cyclical phenomenon, in that when you're studying and you want to take a, I don't know, if you're trying to get a job and you can't get a job, then you might just choose to go to university, even though it's expensive, because that will give you some options farther down the line. This may not be the case for the first time in a really, really long time, because this is not just an economic recession. This is a public health crisis where a lot of campuses won't be opening come next academic year for the Northern Hemisphere. And I think it's going to be a really difficult question. I think there's going to be a lot of programs that will have to get creative in the way that they fund the education. So a lot of boot camps. I know you guys are familiar with this question, but have tried to go the ISA route, income sharing agreements, where the employer would pay for your education, basically. And that model is, people are really scared that model is going to blow up because employers won't be able to pay for that. So it's going to be an interesting question. It's definitely going to be a big part in the changes that we'll see in education in the next year, and we're going to see a big contraction of the labor market.
Yeah, I think I don't have too much to add on to what Alberto's saying. I think for the short term, I think the demand is far going to outstrip the supply of the opportunities available in this time. I think where, I guess I will plug my favorite topic to plug into every conversation that I have. I think for the longer term, like labor market trends, I think COVID in a lot of ways is kind of accelerating things that were already starting to happen. So obviously, like the digitization of jobs, progressively the increase of technology use in those jobs. A lot of industries that were probably the ones where you were like, AI is going to be the least disruptive for them. Hospitality, in-person services, all of these ones, like they have not that much of an incentive to look at them super closely right now. And COVID kind of forces them to, well, now they're basically looking at everything. And when they come out of this, they are probably going to come out of this with more technology and a higher need for technology skills from the workers that they're bringing in. We might also find certain industries where they're finding more remote working opportunities, which oftentimes also means outsourcing and globalization that maybe before didn't really like need to think about that. I think the trend that's probably also been greatly accelerated, I think, on the industry side. So in manufacturing, which is something that we look a lot at in Southeast Asia, manufacturing, I think, was already facing some serious pressures from automation, serious pressures from the trade war with between the US and China, and what that means for people rethinking their supply chains. And COVID probably is going to accelerate that trend as well. And so I think what it's going to probably mean is a reshifting of a lot of the way that that labor markets work. And the real focus is probably going to be on trying to add the kind of key technology skills that are going to undergird a lot of transition. And that's probably going to mean a lot of reskilling that is required, which in most places is going to need to be supported by the state, because it's probably going to fall on people who are the least likely to be able to kind of to self-afford those transitions.
Yeah, and just to quickly touch on that point, I think Orlean was spot on. I think we're going to see a lot of investment in technology in areas that we were probably not expecting to get to that point until maybe 5 to 10 years from now. There's another really interesting blog post from an economist, a British economist, that I'll link to, that talks about how in very competitive labor markets, companies have an incentive to invest in technology and have been doing so for the last 5 or 10 years, to a point where we're not really seeing it, because that investment takes multiple years to really pay off in terms of increases in productivity. I think that increases in investment is only going to continue, because there's so many industries that just will have to be automated, because we won't be able to have humans perform that job, and there'll be such a critical need for those technologies, with social distancing probably lasting roughly a year in different capacities, in different. There's a lot of uncertainty as to how that would look like, but we probably won't get back to normal until a vaccine is developed for COVID-19. So I think we're going to see a lot of big changes around this, and I want to think that governments will have to play a role in that because I want to think that will be the tide that lifts all boats. There was a comment that was really sharp. It talked about Pell Grants in the U.S. They're starting to include more programs that I think there will be a lot of programs like, and I think Eskwelabs is really well positioned to do this type of training. And hopefully governments are able to empower a lot of these programs to appear and lead that upskilling, because governments themselves are not the best last mile providers of training. They're really good supporters and enablers, but they're not the best position to provide that last mile of training.
Cool. So it sounded like what we talked about started off with something that is a bit more specific, like, how can educators improve their mindset? How can they change their mindset immediately to deliver a better experience for students? Then we talked a bit more about, okay, well, if this is going to continue, it's going to exacerbate vulnerabilities we're already seeing in the system, inequalities that we inherently have. And now it sounds like there is a larger crisis around how future work is going to be changed and the implication that we'll have for learning anyways. So I know we're just actually right on time. Do you guys want to get like 1 or 2 sentences, final thoughts that you want to get in to share with our audience before we end? Are you positive? So maybe it's a positive or negative. Are you positive about the future of learning, given what's happening now and the direction that you think we're going in?
Yeah, I think on my side, I think the main positive thing, I think, is that a lot of people and a lot of systems are forced now to think about what it means to reform and transform. And this is kind of the thing that's hard about systemic reform, is that oftentimes it won't happen until there is like such a severe shock that it is kind of has to happen. We don't know exactly what shape it is, and it's probably not going to be as revolutionary as we hoped it to be, but it's also not going to be things that's normal. So wherever we go, there's going to be something to take away from this, and I hope we can kind of steer that dialogue in a positive and effective direction as practitioners in this space.
Yeah, I'll just add to that I think overall, in the long term, it will be positive. We're definitely going to have a lot of challenges in the coming months, but I think that's the nature of systemic change and revolutions that happen, revolutions or these kind of sort of black swan events, right? There is a lot of uncertainty in the short term, but in the long term, it's net positive. And in terms of like last minute points, I'm writing a newsletter on a lot of these topics that will come out on Monday. So if anyone here is interested in following it, just look up Transcend Network Substack and you'll find it, or transcend.substack.com. And then you can get more refined thoughts in a lot of these surveys that, as you can see, I love on Monday on your inbox.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. And I think if anything, it's of course uplifting to hear that people in the education space are positive about the direction. And I think we definitely do have to be. Now it's, maybe a good time to start teaching people how they can continue to learn, how they can continue to reinvent themselves. And if anything, that's our responsibility to continue to do that. So we will share, I think, our contacts as well as Alberto's contacts in the comments if anybody wants to reach out and continue this conversation. And definitely in the days to come, we'll try to put out, at least on our end, more resources that we can share around online classes we're doing and best practices around those that can help any educator out. And of course, if you go to the Transcend Network, there's just a treasure trove. If you enjoy the links that Alberto shared, he's got so much more of those where those came from. So thank you guys both so much for joining this conversation, and everybody on the stream as well for asking very intentional questions about the future of learning in a post-COVID world.
Yeah.
Okay, amazing.
Thanks for organizing.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, guys, we're going to be going off the stream now. Have a good day or evening.
Thanks to everyone who came.
Bye.